Chapter 11, Is the Bucket Full? With Blaze out of town for the next while, Caleb found himself anxious to see Grace the following morning. The relief of having a friend in on all of this future stuff was overwhelming. He hadn't, until this day, realized the amount of stress that was involved in keeping so many secrets all to himself. He felt good now he had company. Grace and Caleb had agreed to meet at the park in the early morning, before school. Caleb had informed his dad that he had a meeting, which was close enough to the truth. Thankfully, his dad did not ask for any details. Caleb and Grace each had blank copies of the weekly activity tally and were intent on doing an accurate recording, starting right from the morning. That was the reason that Caleb thought they were meeting, but he quickly learned Grace had other plans. From the moment he got within earshot of the fallen tree Grace was sitting on, the questions started. Grace wanted to know everything she could about what Caleb had discovered of the future. "So, tell me about your first meeting with Blaze," Grace began. Caleb did his best, filling Grace in on all the details right up to their library discussion of the day before. Well, most of the details. Despite several attempts, Caleb could not find a way to tell Grace how they apparently were going to be a couple in the future. Caleb couldn't tell if Grace was picking up on his awkwardness as he tried to dance around the subject. Probably wouldn't notice anyways, Caleb thought, as he saw how Grace was enthralled by every detail about the future. She was particularly keen to hear about how they were all going to play a role in saving the world. "So, we're all going to be amazing. I have to say, I'm stunned," Grace said. "I would not have predicted that we would be so important." "I think that's the way it is for many seemingly ordinary folks that do great things," Caleb responded. "It's not planned. It comes about from how you react to opportunities and the decisions you make." So much to think about. All that information is great, Caleb. This is so unbelievable. But it brings up so many more questions. I'm going to start writing them down, so I can ask Blaze. There are just so many possibilities. Knowing what's coming is sure exciting. I am surprised that you aren't more curious. Well, I am. But you have to realize that I am just thrilled to have my learning on track. I'm beginning to feel like I can actually be successful. I know you've been doing pretty well all along, so it's probably not such a big deal to you. It is for me, so that's taking up a good part of the time I've spent with Blaze. You'll also find that it's not always easy to get straight answers from Blaze about the future. He often seems rather slow to discuss things. I'm sorry, of course. You know, I have noticed how much happier you seem at school. I think that's great. It hasn't always been easy at school for me though. I feel like I could still be doing much better. If we're so important for the future of the world, we should be as prepared as we can be. There will be a lot riding on our ability to learn new things in our lives. Promise me you'll tell me how you've turned things around?" Grace asked. "Of course. You can start with the videos, and we can discuss any details or questions that come up. I thought we were going to talk about the activity tally this morning, but I suppose I should have realized you would have a lot of questions about the future." Caleb nodded. "It's a lot to take in. About the tally, let's talk about it at lunch," Grace suggested. "How about recess? That way we don't miss the basketball game with our other friends. I do want to get better at playing, so I can't miss any opportunities," Caleb responded. "What about Asher? What do we say to him?" Grace queried. "I really think Asher will benefit from all those clever quick materials. I think we should let him in on this," added Caleb. "That's not what I meant." Grace laughed. "Oh, right. Well, what do you think?" Caleb asked. "I don't think we should bring up the future stuff until we've checked with Blaze. You did say that Asher plays an important part in the future as well, didn't you? So, at some point, we'll need to give him all the information," Grace concluded. "Good points. Yes, let's start sharing the learning steps and leave the future part out for now," agreed Caleb. "Okay, first things first. I'll try to settle down a bit with my questions about the future. I'll save them for when we meet up with Blaze. This week let's concentrate on the clever quick materials. We can start by getting this activity tally set up. Let's get a few copies of this blank tally sheet made. Grace pulled the copy from her backpack. I know Asher will want one, and I think there are others who could benefit. I'll talk to our teacher, Mr. Badial. I'm sure he wouldn't mind. He might even be interested in sharing it with the rest of the class. The rest of the day, and the week, went fast. By Saturday morning they were hunched over the kitchen table at Caleb's house, on track with finishing up their activity tally. Asher had been really excited about the clever quick ideas and had already started to organize his at-home study spot, as well as completing an activity tally. In fact, he would have joined them if he hadn't had a family thing he was involved with. Asher spent many Saturdays on fishing trips down at the river with his father Dan, mother Alex and sister Bowie. Caleb was a bit envious of all the adventures Asher had. For Grace's part, she was quickly catching up with the clever quick steps. It turned out she didn't have as many changes to make as Caleb required. They were just finishing up a snack when they heard a shout from the backyard. "That sounds like Blaze," Caleb said, perking up. "I didn't think he was here," Grace responded. "Neither did I. I haven't seen him since last week." Caleb stood and they both went to the door. Sure enough, Blaze was in the backyard. He was beckoning them to come out. Like most homes in the area of the city Caleb lived in, the yards were quite compact. At the back corner of the lot there was a small, covered garage, filled with all sorts of wood, tools and equipment. There was no room for a car, so his father had to park on the street. Next to the garage, and stretching all the way along the back fence, there was a vegetable garden. Between the garden and the house there was a small patch of grass. To the left was a picnic table and umbrella stand. To the right, there were planter boxes with flowers. Blaze stood in front of the boxes, by the fence. "I have a puzzle for you to solve." "You said you liked puzzles, right, Grace?" Blaze exclaimed. I said I liked word puzzles. I don't see any words." Grace responded. "Well, no matter. Caleb, I know you like all kinds of puzzles. And Grace, words or not, I think you'll like this one." "Tell us about it," Caleb said, as he surveyed the piles of rocks and sand lined up along the fence with a couple of buckets. "Well, very simply, it involves putting as much of these materials as possible into this one empty bucket. You'll start with these," Blaze said, gesturing toward the piles. Grace and Caleb glanced from pile to pile. Caleb looked perplexed. Grace's eyes were narrowing. "Caleb, why don't you give it a try?" Blaze challenged. "Okay, I think I'll try the sand first," Caleb responded. He laid the empty bucket next to the sand pile and pushed what sand he could in with a shovel. He then picked the bucket up and scooped the rest of the sand in. Next, he dragged the bucket up to the gravel pile and started shoveling. He got most of it in, pushing down on the top with his boot. There was still some gravel left on the ground. "What about that gravel and all those big rocks?" Blaze asked, pointing to the materials still piled on the ground. Caleb continued jumping on the bucket, trying to press down the contents more. "Ain't going to happen," he finally declared. "Not possible." Was all Blaze said. "Let me try." Grace suddenly spoke up, a smile playing on her lips as she tossed her hair back. "Be my guest," said Caleb. "But I don't think you're going to be able to get the rest in." As Blaze emptied the bucket and separated the sand and gravel with a rake, he noticed Grace studying the piles carefully and looking into the empty bucket. "I'm going to try a different approach," Grace said, reaching for the big rocks. One by one, Grace placed them into the bucket. Caleb grinned as Grace placed the last one in. The bucket looked just about full. "Well, so much for that approach," Caleb thought, smiling broadly. Next, Grace took the shovel and began scooping the gravel up and raining it over the big rocks. Caleb's grin gradually left his face as shovelful after shovelful of the gravel bounced and careened into all the little gaps between the big rocks. With one scoop of gravel left, Grace bent over and began bouncing the bucket up and down on the ground, finally hitting the side several times with the shovel. She judged, correctly, that enough gravel had settled that she could get the last bit in. Triumphantly, she paused and looked up. All the gravel was in the bucket. Just the sand remained. Grace got to work with the shovel, following the same process she had with the gravel a moment before. Before long, Grace was tapping the sides with the shovel and sifting the remaining sand into the bucket. "What?" Caleb exclaimed. "How is that even possible?" "There, now it's full. Nothing else going in there," Grace smugly declared. "Good job, Grace," Blaze exclaimed. "But are you sure it's completely full?" "Absolutely," Grace nodded. "Did either of you happen to notice this half bucket of rainwater by the fence?" Blaze asked, stooping and picking it up. Both Caleb and Grace looked on, puzzled. Slowly Blaze tilted the water bucket and dripped it over the mix of sand, gravel and rock. As quickly as the water puddled on top, it drained into the mix. Blaze kept pouring until every last drop was in the bucket. As Caleb surveyed the empty ground in front of them, and the now full bucket, he realized he had gone about the puzzle all wrong. Grace also looked somewhat perplexed. She had solved most of the puzzle, but even she had not been quick enough to figure out the bucket hadn't been full when she stopped. "So, what can all this show us?" Blaze asked. "Don't try the puzzle first if you don't know what you're doing?" asked Caleb. "Don't be too quick to say something is full, or completely done, unless you've really thought things through," Grace offered. "Both those reflections are good. But there's a bigger lesson, and it has to do with the activity tallies you've been doing this week, in preparation for making a weekly schedule," Blaze replied. "You see, if you think about these things as the activities you need to fit into each week, you'll be able to set up the best possible schedule. The big rocks represent the really important things that you must include each week. Those are things like your school classes, any part-time jobs you might have, your sleep time and your meals. They go on your schedule first. Next will be the gravel. These are all the things that you should do each week. Those would be activities like homework, chores and perhaps church and time with your family. Then comes the sand. These are the things that you would like to do. Those would include time chatting with friends, playing video games, playing basketball, and reading for pleasure," Blaze went on. "Oh, I get it now," Caleb explained. "When I started by putting the sand in the bucket first, it would be the same as scheduling the like items first, and not having enough time for all the should items, and no room at all for the must items. Not a good way to plan for a week. Or our life, Caleb," added Blaze. "Yes, this is going to be helpful to remember when we set up our weekly schedules," Grace added. "We need to begin with the big rocks first, the essential items, the musts, if we have any hope of fitting them in. You folks definitely get it. I'm glad we took time with this puzzle today. Later, when you've completed your activity tallies, you need to watch video A11, Variety and Balance." "One question, Blaze," Grace interjected. "What was the water supposed to show us?" "Oh, the liquid we poured in." "Yes. Well, Grace and Caleb, that was to demonstrate that no matter how crazy busy and crammed up your week is, with all manner of activities, there can always be time to share a cola or a root beer with good friends. By the way, I'm thirsty. What's in the fridge, Caleb?"